Everybody, welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we're smack dab in the middle of a short chapter 8 of A People's History of the United States. We should finish up this episode. If you like what you hear, hit that like and subscribe button, will you? Let's dig in. General Kearny moved easily into New Mexico, and Santa Fe was taken without battle. An American staff officer described the reaction of the Mexican population to the U.S. Army's entrance into the capital city. Our march into the city was extremely warlike, with drawn sabers. With drawn sabers and daggers in every look. From around corners, men with surly countenances and downcast looks regarded us with watchfulness, if not terror, and black eyes looked through latticed windows at our column of cavaliers, some gleaming with pleasure, and others filled with tears. As the American flag was raised and the cannon boomed its glorious national salute from the hill, the pent-up emotions of many of the women could be suppressed no longer, as the wail of grief arose above the din of our horses' tread and reached our ears from the depths of the gloomy-looking buildings on every hand. Lilith Mud Puddle, everyone. That was in August. In December, Mexicans in Taos, New Mexico, rebelled against American rule. As a report to Washington put it, many of the most influential persons in the northern part of this territory were engaged in the rebellion. The revolt was put down and arrests were made, but many of the rebels fled and carried on sporadic attacks, killing a number of Americans, then hiding in the mountains. The American army pursued, and in a final desperate battle in which 600 to 700 rebels were engaged, 150 were killed, and it seemed the rebellion was now over. In Los Angeles, too, there was a revolt. Mexicans forced the American garrison there to surrender in September 1846. The United States did not retake Los Angeles until January after a bloody battle. General Taylor had moved across the Rio Grande, occupied Matamoros, and now moved southward through Mexico. But his volunteers became more unruly on Mexican territory. Mexican villages were pillaged. One officer wrote in his diary in the summer of 1846, "We reached Barita," "We reached Barita about 5 p.m. Many of the Louisiana volunteers were there, a lawless, drunken rabble. They had driven away the inhabitants, taken possession of their houses, and were emulating each other and making beasts of themselves. Cases of rape began to multiply. As the soldiers moved up the Rio Grande to Camargo, the heat became unbearable, the water impure, and sickness grew, diarrhea, dysentery, and other maladies, until 1,000 were dead. At first the dead were buried to the sounds of the Dead March, played by a military band. Then the number of dead was just too great, and formal military funerals ceased. Southward to Monterey, in another battle where men and horses died in agony, and one officer described the ground as slippery with foam and blood. Ugh. After Taylor's army took Monterey, he reported some shameful atrocities by the Texas Rangers, and he sent them home when their enlistment expired. But others continued robbing and killing Mexicans. A group of men from a Kentucky regiment broke into one Mexican dwelling, threw out the husband, and raped his wife. Mexican guerrillas retaliated with cruel vengeance. As the American armies advanced, more battles were fought, more thousands died on both sides, more thousands were wounded, more thousands sick with diseases. At one battle north of Chihuahua, 300 Mexicans were killed and 500 wounded, according to the American accounts, with few Anglo-American casualties. The surgeons are now busily engaged in administering relief to the wounded Mexicans, and it is a sight to see the pile of legs and arms that have been amputated. Oh. Howard Zinn does not hold back, does he? An artillery captain named John Vinton, writing to his mother, told of sailing to Veracruz. The weather is delightful. Our troops in good health and spirits, and all things look auspicious of success. I am only afraid the Mexicans will not meet us and give us battle. For to gain everything without controversy after our large and expensive preparations would give us officers no chance for exploits and honors. Vinton died during the siege of Veracruz. The U.S. bombardment of the city became an indiscriminate killing of civilians. One of the Navy's shells hit the post office. Others burst all over the city. A Mexican observer wrote, "The surgical hospital, which was situated in the convent of Santo Domingo, suffered from the fire, and several of the inmates were killed by fragments of bombs bursting at that point. While an operation was being performed on a wounded man, the explosion of a shell extinguished the lights, and when other illumination was brought, the patient was found torn to pieces and many others dead and wounded." In 2 days, 1,300 shells were fired into the city until it surrendered. A reporter for the New Orleans Delta wrote, "The Mexicans variously estimate their loss at from 500 to 1,000 killed and wounded, but all agree that the loss among the soldiery is comparatively small, and the destruction among the women and children is very great." Colonel Hitchcock, coming into the city, wrote, "I shall never forget the horrible fire of our mortars, going with dreadful certainty and bursting with sepulchral tones often in the center of private dwellings. It was awful. I shudder to think of it." Still, Hitchcock, the dutiful soldier, wrote for General Scott a sort of address to the Mexican people, which was then printed in English and Spanish by the tens of thousands, saying, "We have not a particle of ill will towards you." Oh my gosh. "We have not a particle of ill will towards you. We treat you with all civility. We are not, in fact, your enemies. We do not plunder your people or insult your women or your religion. We are here for no earthly purpose except the hope of obtaining a peace." That was Hitchcock the soldier. Then we have Weems the historian. If Hitchcock, the old anti-war philosopher, thus seemed to fit Henry David Thoreau's description of small movable forts and magazines at the service of some unscrupulous man in power, it should be remembered that Hitchcock was first of all a soldier, and a good one, as conceded even by the superiors he had antagonized. It was a war of the American elite against the Mexican elite, each side exhorting, using, killing its own population as well as the other. The Mexican commander Santa Anna had crushed rebellion after rebellion, his troops also raping and plundering after victory. When Colonel Hitchcock and General Winfield Scott moved into Santa Anna's estate, they found its walls full of ornate paintings, but half his army was dead or wounded. General Winfield Scott moved toward the last battle for Mexico City with 10,000 soldiers. They were not anxious for battle. 3 days' march from Mexico City at Jalapa, 7 of his 11 regiments evaporated. Their enlistment time's up. Justin Smith writes, "It would have been quite agreeable to linger at Jalapa, but the soldiers had learned what campaigning really meant. They had been allowed to go unpaid and unprovided for. They had met with hardships and privations not counted upon at the time of enlistment. Disease, battle, death, fearful toil, and frightful marches had been found realities. In spite of their strong desire to see the halls of the Montezumas, out of about 3,700 men, only enough to make one company would engage, and special inducements offered by the general to remain as teamsters proved wholly ineffective. On the outskirts of Mexico City, at Churubusco, Mexican and American armies clashed for 3 hours. As Weems describes it, those fields around Churubusco were now covered with thousands of human casualties and with mangled bodies of horses and mules that blocked roads and filled ditches. 4,000 Mexicans lay dead or wounded. 3,000 others had been captured, including 69 U.S. Army deserters who required the protection of Scott's officers to escape execution at the hands of their former comrades. The Americans lost nearly 1,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. As often in war, battles were fought without point. After one such engagement near Mexico City with terrible casualties, a Marine lieutenant blamed General Scott. He had originated it in error and caused it to be fought with inadequate forces for an object that had no existence. They don't say whether that's in it. I mean, I guess that's in a diary. He doesn't really say. In the final battle for Mexico City, Anglo-American troops took the height of Chapultepec and entered the city of 200,000 people, General Santa Anna having moved northward. This was September 1847. A Mexican merchant wrote to a friend about the bombardment of the city. In some cases, whole blocks were destroyed and a great number of men, women, and children killed and wounded. General Santa Anna fled to Huamantla, where another battle was fought, and he had to flee again. An infantry lieutenant wrote to his parents what happened after an officer named Walker was killed in battle. General Lane told us to avenge the death of the gallant Walker, to take all we could lay hands on. And well and fearfully was his mandate obeyed. Grog shops were broken open first, and then, maddened with liquor, every species of outrage was committed. Old women and girls were stripped of their clothing, and many suffered still greater outrages. Men were shot by dozens, their property, churches, stores, and dwelling houses ransacked. Dead horses and men lay about pretty thick, while drunken soldiers yelling and screeching, were breaking open houses or chasing some poor Mexicans who had abandoned their houses and fled for life. Such a scene I never hope to see again. It gives me a lamentable view of human nature and made me for the first time ashamed of my country. The editors of Chronicles of the Gringos sum up the attitude of the American soldiers to the war. Although they had volunteered to go to war, and by far the greater number of them honored their commitments by creditably sustaining hardship and battle, and behaved as well as soldiers in a hostile country are apt to behave, they did not like the army, they did not like the war, and generally speaking, they did not like Mexico or the Mexicans. This was the majority, disliking the job, resenting the discipline and caste system of the army, and wanting to get out and go home. One Pennsylvania volunteer stationed at Matamoros late in the war wrote, "We are under very strict discipline here. Some of our officers are very good men. But the balance of them are very tyrannical and brutal toward the men. Tonight on drill, an officer laid a soldier's skull open with his sword. But the time may come, and that soon, when officers and men will stand on equal footing. A soldier's life is very disgusting." On the night of August 15th, 1847, volunteer regiments from Virginia, Mississippi, and North Carolina rebelled in northern Mexico against Colonel Robert Treat Payne. Payne killed a mutineer, but two of his lieutenants refused to help him quell the mutiny. The rebels were ultimately exonerated in an attempt to keep the peace. Desertion grew. In March 1847, the Army reported over 1,000 deserters. The total number of deserters during the war was 9,207, 5,331 regulars, 3,876 volunteers. Those who did not desert became harder and harder to manage. General Cushing referred to 65 such men in the 1st Regiment of the Massachusetts Infantry as incorrigible, mutinous, and subordinate. The glory of the victory was for the President and the generals, not the deserters, the dead or the wounded. Of the 2nd Regiment of Mississippi Rifles, 167 died of disease. 2 regiments from Pennsylvania went out 1,800 strong and came home with 600. John Calhoun of South Carolina said in Congress that 20% of the troops had died of battle or sickness. The Massachusetts volunteers had started with 630 men. They came home with 300 dead, mostly from disease. And at the reception dinner on their return, their commander, General Cushing, was hissed by the men. The Cambridge Chronicle wrote, "Charges of the most serious nature against one and all of these military officials drop daily from the lips of the volunteers." Excuse me. As the veterans returned home, speculators immediately showed up to buy the land warrants given by the government. Many of the soldiers, desperate for money, sold their 160 acres for less than $50. The New York commercial, and $50 was worth more than obviously then than it is now. And I can't really tell you, how that relates. The New York Commercial Advertiser said in June 1847, "It is a well-known fact that immense fortunes were made out of the poor soldiers who shed their blood in the Revolutionary War by speculators who preyed upon their distresses." A similar system of depredation was practiced upon the soldiers of the last war. Mexico surrendered. There were calls among Americans to take all of Mexico. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed February 1848, just took half. The Texas boundary was set up at the Rio Grande. New Mexico and California were ceded. The United States paid Mexico $15 million, which led the Whig intelligencer to conclude that we take nothing by conquest. Thank God. That's why the weird title for the chapter. Alright, well that's it for chapter 8. Thanks for joining me. I think that was a bit short, but we're going to leave it there anyway. Yeah, hit the like and subscribe button if you enjoyed the reading, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.